Welcome to Hallownest, a kingdom of bugs. Although, you're not really a bug, and it's no longer really a kingdom. You are a Hollow Knight, but not the Hollow Knight, that's the bad guy. Well, not really the bad guy, they're just being mind controlled by a giant moth, but we'll come back to that. So, what are you doing here? Well, you've come to find your sibling. Although, not that one, and not that one, and not those ones, but this one. The only problem is, they've been locked inside a giant egg to stop an infection from spreading. But the infection spread anyway, and now you've got to spend almost the entire game just trying to unlock the door again. Your final goal is to get inside the egg and stop the infection from spreading, even if you are way too late and almost all the residents of Hallownest are already dead. How are you going to stop the infection? We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But who are you in all of this? Ultimately, you are just a forgotten, discarded knight of a long-dead civilization, still driven by your duty to a king and a father that has long since disappeared. You were born for one purpose, and however hopeless it may seem, it is your cruel destiny to fulfill it. But let's start at the beginning. You've just dropped down into King's Pass and you've completely forgotten how to control the game. Well, if you run into this door long enough, you'll be prompted to try hitting it. By the way, these doors used to knock you back when you hit them, but that was removed, so it feels a bit nicer, I guess. Your first enemy is a Crawlid, although it doesn't spawn in until you're close enough to make sure it's in a good position. It used to have a flat top, but they made it more and more spiky to stop people from jumping on it. But if you don't want to kill it or jump over it, then it will chase you back to a geodeposit you might have missed at the start of the game. It's a small secret to encourage you to check every corner, but not big enough to cause a distraction. Our next obstacle is a shallow hole, where you are kindly encouraged to try holding the jump button rather than just pressing it. And that'll be important for the next platforming section. Overall, King's Pass is structured so we move upwards and to the right, which always feels good, and going downwards in Hollow Knight is pretty awkward sometimes, so it is kind of odd that the rest of our journey is about descending into Hallownest, but there you go. To make things a bit more interesting, the game introduces us to stalactites, which might take some health off you before the healing tutorial. You can knock these out of their path, by the way, which can lead to awkward situations, but you can also just jump and upslash them before they fall if you notice them early. But no one ever does that. The last thing the game teaches in the King's Pass is how to focus, but the focus prompt only appears if we've already lost health and we have enough soul, so if a player is skilled enough to do the entire tutorial without taking any damage, then the prompt might not appear until they're in the middle of a boss fight. We also have a nice optional section, and you can tell it's optional because it's covered in darkness until you enter. As with every optional path, there needs to be some easy way to get back to where you started when you're done. With this one, there's the neat solution of just falling to the bottom. Although, if you do hit the spikes, the game puts you back near the healing tutorial in case you needed a reminder. We then get our first look at lifeblood. These aren't used as rewards in the game, instead you'll be able to find them in tricky areas and near boss fights where you might need a bit of a helping hand. And fun fact, it's possible to launch a life seed down to the lowest part of King's Pass. That's not useful, I just think it's funny. To make things a bit more exciting, the floor drops out from under you, although if you're quick enough to realise what's happening, then you'll be rewarded by this Geo Rock. There's another one a bit further on, and an optional challenge if you've worked out how pogoing works. But players who haven't yet will just ignore this path and not worry about it. The problem with getting Fury is that it's hard to create a shortcut back up in such a small space, so instead you're just sent back to near the beginning. It gives you another opportunity to collect this Georock if you missed it the first time though. At the end of King's Pass is the first physical appearance of a Hallownest seal, which is appropriate as it's literally sealing the way into Hallownest. These things appear absolutely everywhere, by the way, in case you'd never noticed them before. The game tells you to step across the threshold into Hallownest, but you never actually have to, it just teleports you into the next room as soon as you break the door. So, we've ended up quite high up, which will stop you wandering back this way if you're lost later on. But we've also been taught twice so far that we don't take any full damage, so off you jump. You can spot the remains of the door you just smashed, as well as part of the old bridge that used to connect up to King's Pass. That's Elderbug that calls it a bridge, by the way, I don't know what it would have looked like originally. Dirtmouth gives us our first look at the knight's walking animation, so we can appreciate the beautiful parallax scrolling. There are 4 main buildings in Dirtmouth, and each one has its own unique style of doors and windows. The Stag Station is marked by another Hallownest seal, the Map Shop is marked by a giant pair of conifers glasses, and Sly's shop is missing its door and is the only building to have left its light on. Although, I don't know if you can turn a Lumify lamp off. They all blend into the background at the moment, so you're not too distracted, but they'll light up later to catch your attention. There are some more empty buildings in the background, and you can even spot some stairs, but thankfully we won't be climbing any of those. And presumably one of these is where Elderbug lives, but who knows. If you didn't pick up Fury, then there's no need to sit on the bench, by the way. The game's already saved your progress here, all it can do is to remove your lifeblood. So there's a famous principle in game design that the door you're supposed to go through should have a light above it. And Hollow Knight's well has 3. Now the real game begins, and it's here that you're given your first choice of which direction to go in. Although going right just takes you around a big U-turn until you get back on the main path. But actually, we've already found the most valuable Geo Rock in the entire Forgotten Crossroads, worth 19 Geo, which is awful. For comparison, you've already fallen past a Hallownest seal worth 450 Geo. Here's the Temple of the Black Egg, the door we're trying to open. There are 3 masks on the door, and one of them is also on Quibble's head. And just to confuse you, they're the other way around outside, and the outdated design of the Dreamers is still visible on the arches. Now we come to an interesting room. So there's a giant husk guarding a grub, and he's standing by some shelves with similar weapons. He's also got a nice table and some stools. These can only be found in one other place in the game, and they also belong to the husk guards, so that's kinda cute. There's also a grub. They cheer and sigh when you walk towards and away from them, but there's a slight delay, so if you get the right pattern, it looks like they're sad when you're coming towards them and happy when you leave. Still not as funny as taunting Elderbug though. But the weirdest thing in this room is the glass window in the background. Window, door, I'm not sure. They appear a lot in the game, but only at the entrances to stag stations, tram stations and large elevators. So let's call them transport windows. But why here? Honestly, I'm not sure. It's possible this was intended to connect up to a large elevator in Crystal Peak, but that seems a bit of a stretch. Interestingly, in one of the old development maps, this room is one of only 2 that is missing from the Forgotten Crossroads. So maybe it was repurposed from somewhere else and they forgot to change the background. We'll see this transport window in a couple of other interesting places, by the way, but we'll cover those when we get there. So you make your way through the long corridors of enemies, and you make it back to the main path. Judging by the wheels, chains and counterweights, all these platforms used to move up and down, which explains how the wagons got there. Although, the platforms would have needed to pass in front or behind the environment, so I'm not entirely sure. But also, this room is one of my favourites for another reason. So normally when you kill an enemy it just explodes, or its body curls up on the floor. But Gruzes are kind of special in that they can keep bouncing for ages after you've killed them, so you can send them flying and watch them bounce all the way to the bottom of the room. So who knows, maybe Team Cherry are Peggle fans. In the top left, you can find Grub Father. It doesn't matter what order you rescue the grubs in, it'll always be the same grub holes that get filled up in the same order, so if you've only rescued one, it will always appear near the front so you spot it when you walk in. There are 46 grubs to rescue in total, but even then you'll only be able to see 42 in Grub Home. There are 4 missing, so for example the 14th grub you rescue will never appear in Grub Home. So what happened to them? I mean, it's possible they're just somewhere you can't see, but also if you use Cheech camera you can see that there are still some empty grub holes. So maybe Grub Father was snacking on the grubs all along and you didn't even notice they were missing, did you? If you come back a bit later, Grub Father will have consumed all the grubs, although this is implied to be a good thing. We never get to see the next stage of their metamorphosis though. If you really want to avoid this, then just don't pick up the last rewards and you'll be able to come back and visit the grubs whenever you want. So what next? You could go and visit Brooding Morlick, where you'll get the tutorial for how to look downwards, so hopefully you didn't leave this boss until 50 hours into the game. The Morlick corpses have these holes in them, which is where the infection comes out of in the one you fight. So were these originally spike holes, eye holes, extra mouth holes? I'm not too sure. Next you can find the cartographer, who sells you a map, which unlocks the ability to walk. You can double tap the quick map button to open the full map instead. The gimmick with Cornifer is that he won't tell you his name unless you talk to him after buying a map, so you can actually go the entire game without ever learning his name, and it will just never appear in the corner of the screen when you talk to him. So that's fun. And if you don't buy Cornifer's maps, then Iselda will sell them in the shop for an increased price. The maps are of course hugely important to a first playthrough of Hollow Knight. It's hard for players to feel like they're making progress when they're lost in a maze of tunnels for half an hour, so filling in a map and gradually collecting the geo to buy the upgrades for it is an easy way to fix that. In the next room, you can pretend to be a speedrunner by deflecting a stalactite into the aspids. The game also tries to teach you about breakable walls by putting a geo rock in front of one. But these aren't just any geoblocks. These are by far the worst 3 geoblocks in the entire game, giving only 10 geo each. But that's not even the worst of it. So, this is a bit complicated, but for most of the game, the more geo you get from a geodeposit, the more hits it takes to destroy it, roughly. So 3 hits gives 15 geo, 4 hits for 24 geo, 5 hits for 30 geo, 6 hits for 56 geo. And that makes sense. It's not precise, but it's near enough. Except, the basic georocks in the Forgotten Crossroads and King's Pass do the opposite for some reason. So that 19 georock earlier only takes 3 hits. There's an 18 georock which takes 4 hits, 15 geo for 5 hits, and then these ones only give 10 geo, but take 6 hits to destroy. I'm pretty sure the only geo deposit that takes more hits is the giant one at the bottom of Kingdom's Edge. These rocks are monumentally bad, and I don't know the reason why. Maybe it's just a programming quirk. The hot springs let you heal and regain soul if you stay in there long enough. Also, this whole room is considered a wet room, so you make splashes when you walk and jump. We're then introduced to 2 new enemies. There's the Golems, although you could also have seen them in an optional path. And I just love that you can still see them popping in and out of the backgrounds, like they're not just an artificial obstacle course. But we're also introduced to the Husk Bully. They look almost identical to the Husk Wanderer, and they do the same thing just a little bit quicker. In fact, they both have almost identical introductions, and they both turn into the same infected variant later on. So that's variation for you. There's also still a load of Vengeflies to take care of, but to be fair, at least you don't have to fight the huge swarms of Vengeflies whose shadows you can see fly across the screen. Okay, so this room is super special, but it's easy to miss why. There's a unique effect where a swarm of Bloomerflies appear and gradually float upwards and then disappear. It's really beautiful, even if their animation speed is half what it should be. In contrast, they just hang around doing nothing in King's Pass. In fact, Lumerflies are the main light source for the entire game. Most lamps will have a Lumerfly inside, and if you break the lamp, it will escape. Although there are 2 types of lamps in this game, old ones and new ones. The old ones are slightly dimmer and in a different style. You can't see the Lumerfly inside, or if you can, then it's not animated. The newer ones are more consistent and have an animated Lumerfly. And you can tell these lamps are older because they're the only ones that appear in the old gameplay footage from 2014. I guess Team Cherry never went back to update them to the new style. They mostly only appear in the Forgotten Crossroads and the streets of the City of Tears, as well as a couple of other minor spots. There's also the Dirtmouth lamps, which are kind of strange and unique. You can't see the Lumerfly inside, but from time to time swarms of Lumerflies come and float around it. So these ones are half updated. But even with the new lamps, there are some problems. Just look at the 2 in the foreground of Grubhome. You can see the Lumerfly poking out of the one on the right, and the one on the left illuminates an area just to the left of it for some reason. And look, I'll put my cards on the table here. I like Lumerflies. They are my favourite thing about this game, and this will not be the last time I talk about them. But getting back to this room, you'll have walked past the Stag Station sign, although you're unlikely to know what that is yet. If you choose to ignore it and go out the bottom left doorway, then you'll be punished with a super long, completely empty corridor that leads to a locked door. Well done. Except it's not completely empty, is it? Because it's filled with things to bash with your nail. The whole game's filled with these things. There are these weird statues, I'm not sure what they're for. There's grass, that's a common favourite. But I love these spiky poles. I think they're the only bashable object that can only be bashed left or right and not up or down. And they're special because you can get them to land head first into the ground and stay there. There's normally a physics system in the game for background objects that you send flying, and sharp objects are able to stick into the ground, particularly dropped weapons, so it's cool that you can experiment around with it here as well. The weirdest thing about background objects though is how they disappear. Sometimes they don't disappear until you leave the room, the same as the corpses of larger enemies. But sometimes they'll wait a while and then shrink, which is bizarre, or else they'll disappear when you're not looking. Sometimes an object will break into multiple pieces, some of which will disappear and some of which won't, and it all depends on which object you're breaking. I know it's a really minor thing, but once you see it, you can't stop looking out for it. Next up is the village. You can tell something is wrong because all of the lamps are missing their Lumerflies, except for the 2 inside the Gruz Mother room. The game's cleverly prepared you for this fight by making you go through the Gruz room earlier, and this boss is exactly the same, but bigger, and both of its attacks are completely different to anything you've seen before. You can see the Pale King's characteristic 4 spikes on a shrine in the background. They appear in a lot of symbols in the game, including the Hallownest seals and to denote the capital of Hallownest. The Pale King actually has 7 spikes on his head, but he's commonly depicted with only 4 or occasionally just 3. In one of these houses you can find Sly, the shopkeeper. And the one on the end is the House of Menderbug. In case you weren't aware, he's kind of a joke character that has a 1 in 50 chance of appearing to fix the Dirtmouth sign, and if you kill him you get to read his diary about how happy and jolly he was, and his crush on this other Menderbug and stuff. Honestly, I'm just impressed with how often Team Cherry included silly or humorous things in their world building without ruining the overall mysterious quality. I think a lot of other games would cross the line with their Easter eggs, but this one is in the sweet spot in my opinion. The Stag Station costs 50 Geo, which is exactly as much as you got for killing Gruz Mother, allowing you to go and visit Sly in Dirtmouth if you've rescued him. You can skip the Stag cutscene by the way by waiting about a second and then pressing any button. I know there's at least one person who never knew that. If you get back on track, then the game shows you another Huskard which gives you a bit of practice jumping over shockwaves before the boss. Although the Huskard has shockwaves each time it jumps, and no shockwaves when it swings its club, whereas the False Knight has this the other way around, which is a bit confusing. The Huskard also has the opportunity to smash open a secret passage, just in case you still weren't looking out for them yet. False Knight is the only boss that can kill other enemies, and also the only boss alongside his Dream variant that you can safely stand on top of. Unusually, you don't get soul when you strike his armour, which encourages you to focus on the fight itself and only heal when you're given the opportunity. Arguably, I think the biggest mistake people make in boss fights is trying to heal at the wrong time, so False Knight is trying to set you up with good habits. There are also barrels falling from the ceiling that you can knock towards him for extra damage. You can even go above the arena later and see where these barrels came from. Maybe it was the maggot friends that were throwing them. Although you don't actually need to dodge any attacks in this fight at all, you can just stand next to it the entire time and damage tank your way through. This becomes particularly easy if you have Stalwart Shell equipped, which means you can survive one more swing in the Tantrum attack before taking damage. This makes it really easy to take out the boss and still be able to heal to full after each phase. In fact, this is so powerful that you can knock False Knight out before he can finish each Tantrum, but the fight will only end when False Knight lives long enough to smash through the floor, so you can potentially get stuck in an infinite loop. The only way to kill False Knight is to stop fighting. As you're probably aware, you can also break the wall above the door to escape early. If you come back round, then the floor will be repaired and False Knight will be back at the top again. And the wall is now made of metal so you can't escape again. That's a good thing, because False Knight drops the City Crest, which is very easy to forget and won't be important until much later. Also, you can still Dream Nail False Knight's armour even when the maggot is outside it. And you can also Dream Nail Mazebug. Up next is a lever that will open the door in the right direction, except you don't need to ever pull this lever. You can go back round to the way you came in. But when the Crossroads gets infected later on, this passage is blocked, so the game just automatically opens the door for you so you can still access Ancestral Mound, just in case you missed Soul Catcher or wanted to get another Whispering Boot. The Snail Shaman gives you Vengeful Spirits, and then locks you in their maze while you're asleep so you'll clear out the enemies for them. In fact, you can tell they're a suspicious character because they use fire as a light source rather than the clearly much superior Lumify lamps. And also the fact that the entire area is covered in skulls. Vengeful Spirit, or Fireball, does 3 times your nail damage at the start of the game. If you kill an enemy with it, then it will have a darkened corpse. It can't pass through walls, and it only has a limited range, but it's still extremely powerful early on. Despite that, most new players ignore it because it costs soul, which is also used for healing. In fact, the game prompts you to test it out on the first enemy, and it even gave you full soul when you woke up, but most people just instinctively use their nail anyway. The Elder Boulder at the end is the first time you're required to use it, and that will hopefully remind you of the only other Elder Boulder you might have seen near the entrance to Green Path, so that's hopefully where you'll go next. They only shoot the little boulders to give you soul, by the way. If you come here without Vengeful Spirit, then they'll only shoot the infection blobs. In this way, Vengeful Spirit acts as both an upgrade and a key. Is this the only way to get out of the Forgotten Crossroads? No. For one, you can save up for the lantern and get into Crystal Peak and Resting Grounds early if you want to, but that's a discussion for another time. But also, there are other ways to escape providing you're willing to do some skips. There aren't actually that many locked doors in the game. Instead, there'll be a high ledge or a long gap that you need a specific ability to overcome. But this means there's almost always some sort of clever way to get past it anyway. The most basic skip involves pogoing off enemies to reach places. These were largely accounted for by Team Cherry. There's also fireball skips, where you can use the knockback of your fireball to help push you a little further. Then we have shade skips, where you die in a certain place and then pogo your shade to get to new places. A more advanced version of this trick uses parrying, where you pogo off your shade's nail to avoid dealing damage to it. In fact, you can even pogo off your shade's fireball. Actually, you can even pogo off your own fireball by firing at a special slope, a technique known as stall ball, but it's extremely precise. With all of these tricks, it turns out that you can basically get anywhere in the game whenever you want if you're dedicated enough. So we could have escaped from the Crossroads way earlier by using a super difficult shade skip to get up to Blue Lake. You don't even need any items. And once you've done that, the rest of the game is basically open to you if you're prepared to do enough hard skips. You also could have stall balled your way into Fungal Wastes, or killed the Elder Boulder before getting Fireball. You may also have seen speedrunners get through this gap using Crystal Dash, but you can even get through here with just Vengeful Spirit using a super difficult shade skip. Not that I can do it, of course. If you want to see how all this is possible, I'd highly recommend videos by Fire Owl and Dan Olav. And all that's before you take into account the fact that you can glitch the game to basically let you fly wherever you want. Basically, there's almost always some clever thing you can do to get to new places. So, we're not going to worry about all that, and let's just assume you're a normal enough player. Maybe you can pogo an enemy every once in a while, but that's about it. Before we leave the Crossroads, let's have a final overview, using this incredible map courtesy of Nook. There's the main road in the middle, which is well paved and mostly flat, used for transporting goods. The slightly less well kept road above it that connects the Dirtmouth and the temple. On one side is the connection to the mines and to the stag station, with a guard outpost, and on the other side is a tall room filled with elevators and a large storage area below. If you drop through a hole in the collapsed floor, then you'll enter the Caves of the Gomes, which feature a road that has seen better days. Eventually it leads to the mostly abandoned village, with a shrine that a Gruz Mother has repurposed as her home. The final road takes us to the centre of the Crossroads, a large room used for storing barrels, with a boss fight taking place in what could have once been a nicer administrative room, judging by the wallpaper and large windows. And of course there's the ancient ancestral mound, which now finds itself encircled by a vast infrastructure project, but which seems to have remained mostly unaffected by the rise and fall of the civilizations surrounding it. There's also been a lot of effort to make contiguous rooms feel connected, like with giant fossil structures that stretch across multiple screens, or machinery that stretches down into the next room. Overall, the main path spirals inwards, making good use of the space. There are a few dead-end paths, but also a few paths that loop back round. These loops always connect back to the main path one room in front of where they started, which massively helps to reduce backtracking. This way, it doesn't matter which way round the loop you go, you'll always end up close to where you started, allowing you to quickly pick up the main path again. There are also a few shortcuts to open that make navigation easier later on. And of course, there's the setups for the entrances to the other areas, the most obvious being the previews of Crystal Peak and Green Path. But there's also the acid pool that will allow us to visit the acidic Frog Canyon, there's a small hint towards a shortcut for the Pilgrim's Way, there's the extravagant City of Tears elevator, and there's the mysterious tramway to come back to later as well. But that's where we're going to have to leave it for the moment. If you want to see a part 2, then subscribe. I still have a lot I can say about this game, I think, but until then, goodbye.